Internet sites were down for hours Tuesday morning after a major outage at one of the largest companies in the world. CloudFlare helps run websites from ChatGPT, X, PayPal, millions of others. So what happened? Jamie Tucker takes a closer look at what CloudFlare does and why it matters in today's Weather Tech.
Many of us think of the internet as a bunch of websites and apps, but behind the scenes there are several companies, not many, that just make sure everything is working. And when one of them has a hiccup, we all feel it. CloudFlare is one of the biggest. It protects websites from attacks and helps them load faster. This morning, the company said a sudden surge in traffic caused parts of its network to fail. Error messages like this from PayPal. And this one, when you tried logging onto ChatGPT, it triggered this pop-up message. That's CloudFlare making sure you're human. And when that system failed, websites could not load at all. Even Down Detector was down for a spell. When it came back up, nearly the entire front page was filled with outage reports. All of this happened just as people were waking up and logging on. Now, that is a surge in activity, but nothing unusual for a company as large as CloudFlare. So what caused the spike even it couldn't handle? CloudFlare says early evidence points to a configuration error and not a confirmed cyber attack. The outage is a reminder that the whole internet relies on about a dozen companies to keep working, and how quickly things can fall apart if one of those companies has a glitch. That's What the Tech. I'm Jamie Tucker.
CloudFlare engineers reported they were no longer seeing any issues early Tuesday afternoon. This was the third major outage from one of these companies in the past 3 years.